Li Zicheng. His forces were not built on ideology, they were built on starvation, recruiting directly from populations the state had abandoned under fiscal pressure. Hunger proved to be history's most efficient recruiter. When Li Zicheng entered Beijing in 1644, the city's walls were not breached, they were simply undefended. The real question is not who brought down the Ming Dynasty, it is why Ming China collapsed before the others. This is not a story about emperors, rebels, or morality. It is a story about systems. During the 17th century, global average temperatures declined by approximately 0.5 to 1 degree Celsius. By modern standards, this may appear modest, yet it was sufficient to expose the structural fragility of the Ming state. Little Ice Age was not defined by cold alone, but by instability. A combination of weakened solar activity, frequent volcanic eruptions, and shifts in oceanic and atmospheric circulation transformed climate patterns from predictable to volatile. Over the following decades, court records from distant civilizations began to describe strikingly similar anomalies. Snow falling in the 6th month, frost destroying summer crops, harvests failing without clear political or military causes. A sustained era of global cooling and climatic disruption that historians later described as the general crisis of the 17th century. It was a stress test applied simultaneously to every civilization on Earth. Some adapted, some transformed. But one of the largest and most sophisticated agrarian empires in history, Ming China, fractured first. The Ming Dynasty was a classic agrarian empire whose fiscal system drew more than 70% of its revenue from land taxes. As long as harvests remained stable, the system functioned, but its capacity to absorb prolonged environmental shocks was extremely limited. To understand the collapse, we must trace the causal chain from the soil to the treasury, rather than focusing on individual historical actors. In Europe, this instability manifested primarily as prolonged cold. In East Asia, the danger was more severe, the destabilization of the monsoon system itself. Chinese agriculture depended on a narrow and precise seasonal rhythm, warm, wet summers, and mild, predictable springs. Once the climate entered an unstable regime, even less than 1 degree of global cooling was enough to push this system repeatedly out of alignment. Frosts arrived early, monsoons weakened or failed, and sudden regional droughts followed. The instability struck the Ming system exactly where it was most exposed: food production. Ming agriculture relied heavily on warm season C3 crops such as rice and wheat, both highly sensitive to temperature drops and frost. Multiple lines of scientific evidence support the scale of the disruption. Tree ring records across North China show repeated, sharp contractions in growth, indicating shortened growing seasons and insufficient accumulated heat. Ice core data from the Tibetan Plateau and polar regions reveal isotopic anomalies consistent with major disruptions in atmospheric circulation and precipitation patterns. Together, these records indicate that between roughly 1620 and 1640, North China experienced a prolonged episode of extreme aridity lasting more than a decade, commonly referred to as the Great Northern Mega Drought, one of the most severe dry periods in the region over the past 5 centuries. When trees could not grow, crops could not either. Between 1590 and 1640, grain prices across China rose 3 to 5 times. 3 consecutive failed harvests produced regional famine. Repeated shocks produced systemic breakdown. This crisis intersected fatally with a demographic peak. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, China's population more than doubled, rising from roughly 70 million to over 160 million. A demographic expansion entering a climatic downturn produced a brutal equation: severe food shortages, minimal surplus buffers, and recurrent famine cycles. This was a classic Malthusian trap, not caused by population growth alone, but triggered by an external climate shock that pushed the system beyond its carrying capacity. This was not a political crisis, it was a caloric crisis. The Ming Dynasty's most lethal structural weakness was fully exposed on the fiscal front. More than 70% of state revenue came directly from agricultural taxation, yet the empire lacked a mature customs system, overseas revenue streams, or sovereign debt mechanisms capable of absorbing large shocks. When harvest failed, the tax base collapsed rapidly. In key northern provinces, tax collection rates reportedly fell from over 80% to less than 30%. Many regions recorded so-called virtual taxes, obligations that existed on paper, but could not be collected in reality. At the same time, imperial expenditures surged. The court was locked into funding massive frontier armies against the rising Manchu state. By the 1630s, Liaodong military expenses alone consumed more than 70% of the already diminished central treasury. When the tax base died, the state followed. This fiscal collapse was further amplified by a simultaneous global monetary shock. The Ming economy depended heavily on imported silver to function. As the Little Ice Age disrupted global trade and European wars intensified, silver inflows declined sharply in the 1630s. Scarcity drove silver's value upward relative to copper coinage, the medium used by ordinary peasants. In effect, the state was running a large fiscal deficit while demanding taxes in a currency whose value was rapidly appreciating. For farmers, the real tax burden rose precisely as agricultural output collapsed. This created a vicious positive feedback loop that shattered the rural economy. Facing collapsing revenue and two existential costs, frontier defense and internal stability, the Ming court made a fatal political triage. It chose defense. Remaining silver was diverted to the northeastern frontier. While internal garrisons were defunded, soldiers went unpaid, and famine relief disintegrated. The result was a vast pool of desperate and mobile people, dismissed soldiers, starving farmers, and landless tenants. Into this vacuum stepped Li Zicheng. His forces were not built on ideology, they were built on starvation, recruiting directly from populations the state had abandoned under fiscal pressure. Hunger proved to be history's most efficient recruiter. When Li Zicheng entered Beijing in 1644, the Ming state was no longer governing a unified empire. It was managing a continent-scale humanitarian collapse. The city's walls were not breached. They were simply undefended. Shortly thereafter, Wu Sangui, stationed at Shanhai Pass, faced the cumulative consequences of unpaid wages, collapsing military provisions, and prolonged logistical neglect. Under these conditions, he made the decisive choice to open the pass to Qing forces. At that moment, fiscal exhaustion, military breakdown, and political fragmentation converged, and the Ming state lost its final structural supports. The Little Ice Age did not kill the Ming Dynasty. It revealed its design limits: a climate-sensitive agricultural base, a highly concentrated and inflexible tax system, an expensive northern frontier that drained reserves, a demographic peak without surplus buffers, and a state incapable of absorbing sustained environmental shocks. But only the exogenous climate shock amplified these weaknesses beyond the system's capacity to adapt. The collapse of the Ming Dynasty stands as a stark case study. Even the most sophisticated political structures remain constrained by the most basic environmental variables. The 17th century crisis was global. While the Ming state fractured, other societies were forced to adapt, pivot, or fundamentally upgrade their systems. Same Cold World, different outcomes. Civilizations share the same planet, but they do not travel the same world line. In the next episode of Worldline, we will see how the very same climate stress that destroyed the Ming Dynasty inadvertently laid the foundations of capitalism in Europe, as states, under pressure to survive, developed more climate-resilient trade networks, diversified crop systems, and financial innovations. These adaptations not only allowed them to endure the Little Ice Age, but in many cases to emerge stronger because of it. Worldline, decoding the logic that shapes the world.